Hello everyone. I'd like to discuss today some of the key changes in the 2024 edition. Well, I can't really call it that anymore because the last book's coming out in 2025, but the 5th edition refresh monster manual. I would say 3 cheers to that because there are some long overdue changes to certain key monsters in that. In particular, reversions are often the better versions in the 4th edition. We'll talk about that when we come to dragons. We'll also briefly discuss the issue of gendered monsters. Raises some particularly tough issues in terms of game design, but I won't want to go into the political issue of transgender monsters because I think that's really avoiding the main issue in terms of the mythos of gendered monsters, which I think is the key issue, and several other commentators on YouTube have discussed. But the main thing that really bugs me is the Cyclops, which I think is a reversion to a worse version of the Cyclops, which rather misses the importance, completely avoids and misunderstands the importance of the Cyclops in mythology, in particular Greek mythology. And the Cyclops is really interesting in terms of mythology because it changes rather dramatically actually between different versions in terms of different poets and writers. If you go to the kind of early, yes, classical version of the Cyclops, Franklin in Hesiod, the Cyclops were noble creatures created by the union of Uranus, the god of the sky, and Gaia, the god of the earth. They were the great craftspeople. They crafted the weapons used by Poseidon's trident, Zeus's lightning rod, and key weapons for all of the gods in the war with the Tritons. Epirions is the odd word for Tritons used in 5th edition. I don't like it. They were noble creatures. They had one eye, but they were noble creatures. Now, I have come across occasional references to Cyclopses having divinatory abilities, possibly referring to this earlier version, but I think they are misunderstanding the writings of Homer, which really Cyclops are anti-divinatory creatures, and I really don't like this addition of divination to Cyclopses because it goes completely against the Homeric version of the Cyclops. In the Homeric version of the Cyclops, a bit of Harry Harryhausen here, which adds a bit of flavour to the Cyclops with his whore and his fawn's legs. They had fallen from grace. He specifically says they had no fire, they had no agriculture, which in the original Greek meant that they didn't grow things. They certainly were herdsmen, and in my own game, Shatterheart, they are Homeric. They are fallen savages that herd giant goats and so on. It's a bit like that famous film, expressionistic film from the 1930s in Spain called People Without Fire, where you had a village that didn't have fire and they pushed goats over cliffs in order to slaughter the goats and eat them. It was all completely made up by the filmmaker according to modern historians, and it was extraordinarily influential film about savagery. It was almost a Homeric theme to it. Now in Homer, they are symbols of a fall from grace and a reversion to savagery, and I've never come across any reference to why did Homer do this, and I think it's really important to understanding Homer and understanding mythology, understanding the history of the Greek Dark Ages in which Homer was writing, and to understand this. Of course, some people would say, well, Homer never existed, the Trojan Wars never existed. Well, come on. It was written by somebody, and somebody was telling a coherent story. So even if it was from very old oral tradition, the idea that Homer was comprised of many different oral songs that were bunged together is now largely discredited, because there is a coherent narrative, a coherent story in both of the Homeric epics. We use the term epic really to describe this. So somebody is is creating this story, and it is a story that did not exist in mythology. It was a created story. In fact, it was completely contrary to many of the ideas of mythology. It was from the Eastern Mediterranean and was completely different to the ideas that came from Mycenaean, i.e. ancient Greek, originally mythology. Now let me explain. The first thing is Odysseus in the Odyssey tricks his way into the Cyclops' cave. Who is there? I'm nobody. Oh, you're nobody. Okay, come in. And the Cyclops is friends with a diviner, and the diviner says you're going to lose your eyesight. And the Polybius, I think, is the name of the Cyclops. Correct me if I'm wrong. And says, "Oh no, I've already been cursed. I've already lost one eye." Now, Homer actually expressly never says that it's a Cyclops, but he refers that phrase and his eye to the fact that he has one eye. Now, is that a creature with two eyes where one is blinded, or a creature that is cursed with one eye? I don't think it matters, because it clearly is an allegory. It is an allegory for the fall of the Cyclops with one eye. And you can say the same about references to earlier creatures. Cyclopses, do they have one eye that's blinded, or it's never expressly said, or they're born with one eye. They're an allegory for the fall of noble creatures, and not to believe philosophy, not to believe divination, because there's always a sting in the tail. There's always a sting in the tail in divination in Greek mythology, and the sting of the tail is you've got to wisely interpret prophecy and not jump to conclusions. Now, I think the historical aspect here is to do with the Greek Dark Ages. The Greek Dark Ages were defined by the fall of Mycenaean and Minoan civilization. It can't be tied historically directly to the volcanic eruption in Santorini and the fall of Minoan civilization, because the dates don't match. The fall began separately, although it was probably weakened extraordinarily, Aegean civilization, and that created an opportunity for what we call the Sea Peoples to come in and invade, and you had a reversion, away from culture, because not everybody had to go back to farming because food was scarce. And it's what we call the Greek Dark Ages, where we have almost no written records, everybody was farming. So I think the Cyclopses, together with many other aspects of Homer, and this is never really pointed out, is a symbolism for the Greek Dark Ages, a reversion away from culture, and the journey of Odysseus, that hopefully we'll see in the new Christopher Nolan version of the Odyssey, it is a story of that, and it's a very savage story. If you look at the new Ralph Fiennes film, The Return, where they include the bit that films often edited out, which is the fact that Odysseus slaughtered all of his suitors to his wife Penelope when he came back together with his son. Brutal, but it's the central theme in that film, and it's absolutely fantastic how Ralph Fiennes shows that brutality with his bow. Of course, Odysseus was a ranger, of course, wasn't he? Always. So that's why I really dislike the Cyclops in the 5th edition. Sorry to the designers of the 5th edition, but I think this is an idea that's going to have to be reverted and changed in the next edition, because I don't mind a giant one-eyed creature with the gift of prophecy. Make it a variant of the Nothic. Please save our Cyclopses. Okay, now briefly cover the issue of gendered monsters because this is a difficult issue. I mean, there are a number of monsters that are specifically gendered, like the Medusa and the succubus. However, in mythology, they tend to be I have male versions of that, such as the incubus or the succubus. Why mess with that? I don't see any reason to mess with that, or to allow a kind of gender swap there. I think there is an issue in that certain monsters were very specifically gendered because of misogyny reflected in earlier societies. I mean, the succubus is a good example of that. Oh, Archbishop, oh, I wasn't having dirty thoughts. A succubus came to me in the night. Women are seductive and willful, etc. And this relates to monsters which are a little bit more problematic because they're single gender only in the stories, such as sirens luring men onto the rocks. Of course, the men were mainly the sailors in those days. So, mermaids. We don't have any problem in contemporary mythologies with men being mermaids, so I don't see any problem with creatures like sirens and mermaids having male versions, especially if you're going to have a playable race, a playable lineage in terminology in my game, Shatterhard. You've got to have that. You've got to allow men to be mermen. I think it's slightly more difficult where the mythology is very specific that certain monsters are men and certain monsters are women. I think in Greek mythology you have men are fauns or satyrs, and they are the very expression of male horniness and excess, and women are nymphs, and nymphs are the expression of female sexuality, and men and satyrs and nymphs bred, and they created satyrs and nymphs. Very odd biology there. In my game, I don't have that because they can have male nymphs. Why not? Expressions of male sexuality, but fauns are the expressions of excess. They often have bacchanalian orgies. If you have orgies, why not have female fauns? And if it's a playable race, because it takes the place of tieflings, which I don't like because they're overpowered, because they're devil, fauns are a neat substitute because they have horns. You can use the same. You can use the same miniature figures for them. Perhaps just saw off the goat's legs and glue two figures together, and you've got a perfect one. So I don't like that, but I think in the biology is odd. It's fantastic and magical, but I think if you're going to have a lineage of species, you've got to have very similar male and female, not interspecies creating. It's just bizarre. So I'm not a purist about that. So I move quickly on from that. I think it's just weird, though. I mean, if you're going to have a creature that can swap gender, make it a variant of a doppelganger or something like that. Don't mess with the mythology. Come on to dragons. I mean, I like the new version of dragons. What hasn't been commented on is this is basically 4th edition dragons. So you have looking back on the 4th edition, you see they basically copied all of the uniqueness of features. Blooded, that renews a breath weapon, and that's great because that really introduces a sense of danger and escalation in it. The fact I never noticed until it was mentioned in the video, and I look back on 4th edition. Aha! Each frightful presence is slightly different. And that's great, in my game. I thought, well, why not, freeze on the spot with a white dragon and so on. That's really interesting. Paralysed if you're a green dragon, a kind of poison, you get paralysed. That introduces some nice effects and uniqueness to each of the species of dragon. More than just the only thing that's really different is the breath weapon. that's great. Having a secondary weapon with its own countdown, you had that in 4th edition. That's a great thing to bring up. I don't like legendary resistances, which means you have to throw away a few spells and then you can do damage. I really like the concept of doom points from Tales of the Valiant. And if you spend one, you roll at edge in any saving throw. I think that's a better mechanic. I like the idea of layer actions being put in the stat block. When I'd already done that in my own game system, it makes sense. It just makes it more readable. And of course, the challenge rating is increased by 1 for any creature when it's in its layer. I like that. I like the idea of varying by age the abilities, so they get more abilities as they age. I'd already taken that in my own system. It means you don't have to have separate stat blocks for 4 different types. For one, you simply, they have a hit dice of 1 to 20, and great wormlings have 20 points on the die. Baby dragons have 1, and that just creates a great deal of flexibility. I think the creator of 5th edition, Mike Myers, said that the great mistake they had is having the same hit dice for every type of monster. A D8, I got rid of that in Shatterheart. You can have all the way up to D20 with dragons and titans and so on. So that's good. What I don't like is making dragons spellcasters, and you really have to look at the history of the Amphisound game to see why that was put in and why it was taken out. Now it was in, if you look at the Dragon's Handbook in the 3rd edition, they even have a whole section on draconic magic. It's difficult to see spellcasters of any creature with without opposable thumbs. You can't really imagine a dragon, great difficulty reading a spell book. You imagine them reading it, but it's hard with a pointy claw. Innate spellcasting is fine, but innate spellcasting has to really relate to the lore. I think it's weird having a wed dragon casting a fireball spell. They've just blown their breath weapon. You think it's fireball. It's a countdown, and then you have a fireball spell. Now, spell casting monsters are always much harder for a GM to run because the GM needs to know every spell, so the prep time is considerably increased. So there has been a tendency in the history of the Amphisound game to substitute spell-like abilities, particularly for lower level monsters like Kobold, Wormling and so on, where this comes really from 4th edition. You could look at the spell-like ability and see, aha, this is how much damage it does, da 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 da. You don't have to look at another book to find out what the spell is. For certain higher level monsters like vampires and so on that can cast spells like becoming into a gaseous form and so on, fine. I mean, as long as it's not too complicated. But it adds complication. And I think it's much better to have the 4th edition where you have spell-like abilities built into the stat block rather than having the immense complexity added to a monster by giving it spell-casting abilities. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you again soon.